Some memories are best left forgotten, but sometimes the past has a way of coming back. One day, while cleaning out the old attic, my mom found a box of old videotapes. We thought they were just family memories, but we were so wrong. What we saw on those tapes can't be explained. And now I wish we had never pressed play. Based on a true story. Not long ago, my mother stumbled upon a forgotten treasure trove of old videotapes, relics from my childhood circa 1990. Her excitement was palpable as she brought them to a photography store, eager to have the man behind the counter virtualize them. Her words, not mine, and transfer their contents onto a sleek, modern pen drive. It struck me as absurdly poetic. Hours of clunky, analog memories distilled into a device small enough to lose between the couch cushions. The day she retrieved her tiny time capsule, she called me with the enthusiasm of someone unveiling a long-lost artifact. She suggested we meet for tea and watch the tapes together. I hesitated. Nostalgia, for me, has always been a double-edged sword. Old photos, childhood anecdotes, they tend to make me wince more than smile. But her excitement was genuine, almost contagious. So, despite my reluctance, I agreed. If nothing else, it seemed like a small price to pay to make her happy. When I arrived, she greeted me with a warm smile and a hug, the kind that felt like coming home. The scent of freshly brewed tea wafted through the air as she ushered me inside, handing me a tray of pastries she'd picked up from the bakery. "Set the table," she said, her voice light and full of purpose, as though this little ritual mattered more than it usually would. I obliged, arranging the sweet treats while she poured tea into delicate cups that had probably seen fewer family gatherings than they deserved. We sat together, savoring the spread she had so thoughtfully prepared, and the conversation naturally turned to my dad. His new job had taken him north to the United States, a world away. We both admitted we missed him. He'd been traveling back and forth, spending 3 months abroad at a time, and the distance felt heavier with every trip. Even the phone calls, brief and sporadic as they were, felt more like placeholders than real moments shared. At some point, I asked if she told my sister about the tapes. She shrugged with a nonchalant smile, the kind that only partially hides a deeper thought. "There aren't many of her," she admitted softly. "I wanted to show you first, just the two of us." There was something in her tone, an intimacy, a quiet sense of importance, that made me feel like this moment wasn't just about the tapes. It was about us. Before I could finish my second cup of tea, my mother clapped her hands with the eagerness of someone who had waited long enough. "Time to watch the tapes," she announced, her excitement spilling over. "You can finish your tea on the sofa." There was no arguing with her, so I followed her lead, carrying my cup as we moved to the living room. Setting up the TV was straightforward, though she hovered beside me, fussing over the details as if the pen drive held the secrets of the universe. I slid the tiny device into the port and took the remote, scrolling through the files that appeared on the screen. There were 7 in total, each unnamed and numbered in the order they had been filmed. No titles, no clues, just raw, unfiltered memories waiting to be unearthed. We started, naturally, with file number 1. My mother settled beside me on the sofa, her eyes bright with anticipation. The screen flickered to life, revealing nothing but a black void. The display indicated the clip was 3 minutes long, but there was no image, only darkness. Then came the sound. Heavy, uneven breathing, and the faint crunch of footsteps on dry leaves, branches snapping underfoot. It sounded like someone walking through the woods, their breaths growing more labored with each step. I glanced at my mother. The excitement that had lit up her face only moments ago had vanished, replaced by a puzzled frown. "Skip ahead a bit," she suggested, her voice uneasy. I obliged, pressing the button to jump forward a few seconds. But nothing changed. The screen remained dark, the footsteps continued, and the breathing grew heavier, almost gasping now. It was then that I realized it wasn't just breathing, it was a woman. You could hear it in the way the sounds caught and faltered, like someone on the edge of tears. "Did you record this?" I asked her, my voice low. She shook her head slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line, then raised a finger to her mouth, urging me to stay quiet. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, her expression tense, almost as if she were holding her breath. And then, just before the clip ended, the sobbing began. It was soft, restrained, like whoever was recording didn't want to be heard. I could tell they were trying to speak. There were faint, broken attempts at words, but nothing coherent came out, just muffled gasps swallowed by silence. My mother gripped the edge of the sofa, her knuckles white, but she said nothing. The screen cut abruptly, and for a moment the room felt impossibly still. Then, as if nothing unusual had happened, a new video began to play. My 4th birthday. The bright, joyful chaos of a child's party filled the screen, but neither of us moved. We just sat there, caught between confusion and unease, trying to make sense of what we had just witnessed. When the last video ended, my mom and I sat in silence. The room felt heavy, though neither of us said a word. After a moment, I remembered the tea in my hands and took a sip, only to grimace at its coldness. My mother noticed immediately, her eyes flicking to the cup. "Do you want me to heat that up?" she asked, but before I could answer, she had already taken it from my hands and disappeared into the kitchen. I followed her, the silence still hanging between us like an unspoken question. Leaning against the doorway, I asked the thing that had been circling in my mind. "What do you think that first video was?" She paused, glancing at me as she set the cup in the microwave. For a moment, her expression was unreadable, but then she smiled. A light, dismissive smile, as though brushing away a stray thought. "Oh, it was probably some mistake," she said with a wave of her hand. "The man at the store must have put it on the pen drive by accident. I'll go ask him about it tomorrow." Her tone was casual, practiced even, but I couldn't tell if it was meant to reassure me or herself. The microwave beeped, and she pulled the cup out, cradling it as if the warmth in her hands might soothe her own unease. "What did you think of the other videos?" she asked, her voice softening as she handed me the tea. "You were such a pretty little girl back then. Oh, how I missed those times." Her words hung in the air, but my mind lingered on the video, on the sound of that woman's breaths and sobs. My mom's attempt to steer the conversation elsewhere didn't feel wrong, but it didn't feel right either. I sipped my tea and nodded, letting her nostalgia fill the silence, though the unease from that first video remained, quietly gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. By the time I left my mother's house, the sky was fading into dusk, the air carrying the weight of an ending day. Before I stepped out, I asked her if I could take the pen drive with me to show it to my husband. She smiled and handed me a second one. "I had a copy made for you," she said. "It was always meant to be yours." When I arrived home, the house was quiet, still bathed in the soft glow of evening. I set my bag down and went straight to my laptop, eager to revisit the tapes, though the memory of that first video lingered uneasily in my mind. As the laptop hummed to life, I slid the pen drive into its port, expecting nothing more than what I'd already seen. But as the files loaded, something new caught my eye. A second folder, one that hadn't shown up on the TV. My curiosity piqued. I clicked on it. Inside were a handful of corrupted documents, files with strange, unreadable names, and a single video. My heart quickened as I hovered over it, the unease from earlier stirring again. I clicked, and the screen opened, dark and familiar. Like the first video from my mother's house, the image was nothing but blackness, but the sound told a different story. The woman's sobbing was more frantic now, her breaths harsh and desperate. The cracks of branches beneath her feet came faster, sharper, as if she were running. Then came the rain, soft at first, then heavier, joined by the low rumble of thunder. The atmosphere thickened, the soundscape alive with tension. And then, out of the void, a flash of light. A bolt of lightning struck a tree, illuminating the screen for a fleeting moment. I froze, my finger hovering over the keyboard. Without thinking, I hit pause. The stillness that followed was deafening. My eyes stayed fixed on the screen. The ghostly outline of the illuminated tree burned into my vision. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Something about that single frame felt too real, too deliberate. And for the first time that night, I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep watching. I steeled myself and pressed play. The burning tree remained in the frame, its flames casting flickering shadows that gave the scene an eerie semblance of life. The camera swayed erratically, capturing glimpses of the turbulent sky above and the muddy ground below. It felt chaotic, disorienting, like watching through the eyes of someone barely holding on. Then came the roar, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the speakers and into my chest. It wasn't human, and whatever it was, it drove the woman into a desperate sprint. Her sobs turned to frantic cries, her voice trembling as she murmured something about God under her breath. The words were too soft to catch, but their despair was unmistakable. A deafening boom rang out, an explosion so jarring that it made me flinch. The woman stumbled, her breathing ragged as the camera tilted violently. And then she fell. The screen glitched, the image fragmenting into streaks of static. But when it cleared, the camera had landed on the ground, its lens now pointing directly at her. I couldn't see her face, only the back of her head, her short, brown hair matted with rain and dirt. She crawled toward the camera, her trembling fingers brushing against its edges. Then, just as she reached for it, she whispered something, a single word. My heart sank like a stone, my chest tightening as if the air had been sucked from the room. A strange weightlessness took over my body, and I became hyper-aware of everything around me. The soft hum of my laptop, the ticking of the clock, even the faint rustle of leaves outside the window. But I couldn't move. My limbs felt disconnected from my will, my mind too consumed by what I had just witnessed. Couldn't blink, couldn't breathe. I was frozen in that moment, trapped by a fear I didn't fully understand. It wasn't just the video. It was the way it had burrowed into my mind, unraveling something deep within me. I wanted to look away, to close the laptop, to do anything to break free from the paralysis that gripped me. But I didn't, or perhaps I didn't want to. Something about the stillness, the helplessness, kept me tethered to that screen, as if moving would shatter the fragile veil between reality and whatever dark truth I had just glimpsed. Then, a single thought pierced through the haze of fear and confusion, cut through the stillness like a blade, sharp and undeniable. She said my name. I couldn't tell you how long I sat there, staring blankly at the screen, my mind twisting itself into knots as I tried to piece together what I just witnessed. The image of the woman running through the forest played over and over in my head, her heavy breathing, the sound of branches snapping underfoot. And then there was her voice, fragile, desperate. The one thing I was sure of, the only thing clear in the chaos, was that she had said my name. Why? Why me? I couldn't answer that. I didn't know who she was, what had been chasing her, or what horror had driven her to the edge of panic. All I knew was the weight of that whisper, the way it lingered, haunting me like the echo of a memory I couldn't quite place. The only thing that pulled me out of my spiraling thoughts was the sound of the front door creaking open. It startled me, made me jump, my heart pounding as if the woman's terror had seeped into me. I turned quickly, half expecting what? I wasn't sure. But instead, it was my husband, stepping inside with a puzzled look on his face. He froze in the doorway, startled by my reaction, and raised both hands as if to calm me. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft with concern as he set his keys on the table by the door. His eyes scanned my face, searching for an answer I couldn't yet give. After a few seconds, I managed a nod. Yes, I'm fine." My voice felt steadier than I expected, but his worried expression lingered. He stepped closer and wrapped me in one of his tight, reassuring hugs, the kind that always seemed to melt away the edges of my anxiety. "Sorry for scaring you," I murmured as we pulled apart. I leaned in and kissed his cheek, a gesture of normalcy I desperately needed. "How was work?" He sighed heavily, loosening his tie before tugging his shirt out of his pants. As he began undoing the buttons, his frustration was written all over his face. "It was all right, I guess. Meetings all day. Felt like a complete waste of time." I couldn't help but smile. There was something endearing about the way he got annoyed at little things like this. His brows furrowed, his tone just slightly exasperated. "So," he said, glancing at me as he shrugged off his shirt, "how was your mother's?" And just like that, any semblance of normalcy vanished from my face. I could feel it slip away, and judging by the way my husband started laughing, he noticed it too. "That bad, huh?" he teased, his grin widening. "The truth is, my mom and I have always had a strange relationship. She's a good mother, better than most, I'd say, but she's not without her moments. Every so often, she'd have these bursts of anger, sharp and unexpected, aimed at me or my sister. It wasn't uncommon for us to go months without speaking, both of us too stubborn to make the first move until someone, usually me, gave in and decided to make peace. My husband knew all of this. He always poked fun at the idea, joking that one day I'd end up as bitter and dramatic as she could sometimes be. "No, it was mostly fine," I said, brushing off his laughter. "She didn't do anything bad." He raised an eyebrow, that playful look of his daring me to admit the truth. "Neither did I added quickly, cutting him off before he could suggest otherwise. "She just wanted to watch some old tapes with me. Most of them were fine, but, there were two that—" I trailed off, unsure how to explain. My voice faltered, and I could see his curiosity shift into concern. "Here, let me show you," I said, pulling out a chair and gesturing for him to sit in front of the computer. He settled down and I queued up the videos. We watched both clips back to back, the eerie darkness of the forest filling the room again. I studied his face as he watched, his expression shifting only slightly. When the second video ended, he leaned back in the chair, puzzled. "What's wrong with them?" he finally asked, turning to look at me. His tone was calm, almost dismissive, as if he couldn't quite grasp why I was so rattled. "What's wrong?" I repeated, my voice rising as a wave of exasperation hit me. How could he not understand? I felt my hands clench involuntarily. Lucas, the woman was running for her life. Something was chasing her. She was terrified, sobbing like she knew she was about to. I swallowed hard, the words catching in my throat. "To die." And he laughed. He actually laughed. "Babe," he said, standing up and placing his hands on my shoulders. His touch was warm, reassuring, but it only made me feel more disconnected. He started rubbing my shoulders gently, as if that could smooth away the tension in my body. "That's just a movie," he said, People used to tape their shows or movies back then if they couldn't watch them live. Your dad probably recorded something random and used the first cassette he found. But she said my name at the end. I insisted, my voice trembling. Clara's a pretty common name, he replied, his tone light, especially back in those days. It's probably just a coincidence. I stared at him, his words brushing past me like a breeze that failed to reach my core. Coincidence. That word felt so thin, so flimsy against the weight in my chest. Come on, babe. It's fine. It's just a movie, Lucas said, leaning down to kiss my forehead. His thumb brushed against my cheek in that tender way of his, the one that always seemed to smooth over my rough edges. He really was a wonderful man, always trying to shield me from my own spiraling thoughts. Why don't I order some pizza, and we can watch something together? It's been a long day for both of us. I nodded and hugged him again, letting the warmth of his embrace momentarily ground me. But as I buried my face in his chest, I couldn't stop the small voice in the back of my mind. Why can't you just believe it's a coincidence? I hated that voice, hated myself for not being able to let it go as easily as he did. A few days later, I called my sister. Do you want to see the videos from the tapes Mom found? I asked, keeping my tone casual. Tapes? She echoed, her surprise evident. She didn't tell me anything about tapes. I could hear the offense in her voice, a familiar tone that surfaced any time Mom left her out of something. Of course, she'd tell you first, she muttered half to herself. But after a moment, her curiosity won out. Yeah, sure. Bring them over. Let's watch them. When I arrived at her flat, it was her daughter, the whirlwind of energy that was my niece, who greeted me at the door. She wrapped me in a quick, enthusiastic hug before bouncing back, eyes alight with excitement. Aunt Clara, you brought the videos, right? I've been dying to see them. I hesitated, holding the pen drive tightly in my palm. We'll see, I said, forcing a smile. She was in film school, and I knew her curiosity was partly academic, but the thought of her watching the first and last videos made my stomach twist. Before I could figure out what to say, my sister appeared at the door. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, ushering me inside. Come on in. I've already got the TV set up, she said, her voice warm but with the clipped efficiency she always carried. I followed her into the living room, clutching the pen drive like it held a secret too heavy to share. Deciding to skip the first video felt like the easiest way to avoid any awkward questions. It's not that interesting, I told them, brushing it off as unimportant. We dove into the others instead, the normal ones, the ones filled with holidays, birthdays, and snapshots of simpler times. As the footage played, nostalgia wrapped itself around me like an old blanket. There were the trips to Villa Gesell, the days spent in that modest cabin owned by my dad's family. Normally, watching my younger self would have been a cringeworthy experience, but today was different. I felt a strange ache in my chest, something bittersweet, as I saw the kid I used to be, glowing with joy, surrounded by the kind of love you only appreciate in hindsight. Midway through one of the clips, my niece suddenly paused the video. Wait, she said, standing up and walking closer to the screen. She pointed at a man standing on the edge of the frame, barely noticeable unless you were looking for him. He wore a fishing hat and dark sunglasses, his face partially obscured, but his profile, his nose specifically, was unmistakable. It bent downward, sharp and pronounced, almost like a vulture's beak. He's in all of the videos, said my niece, her voice tinged with curiosity. Always at the side, or far in the background, just out of focus. I blinked, her words catching me off guard. My eyes flicked back to the screen, and the realization hit me like a sudden chill. She was right. I had never noticed him before. Oh, I said, offering a weak laugh. That's our grandfather. I smiled at the memory of him, though faint and distant now. The moment I turned to my sister, the smile faded. She wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at me, and her face had gone ashen, her eyes wide and filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear. Is something wrong? I asked, my voice wavering slightly. My sister blinked, snapping herself out of whatever had gripped her. She cleared her throat but couldn't hide the tremor in her voice. Camila, sweetie, she said, forcing a calmness she didn't feel. Can you go to your room for a minute? Camila's expression shifted, her usual playful demeanor giving way to quiet obedience. She nodded and slipped away without another word, leaving us alone in the room. I turned back to my sister, confusion knotting in my stomach. What's going on? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out, clutching my hand with both of hers. Her grip was firm, but her fingers trembled slightly. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. That man, she said, her lip quivering, isn't our grandfather. What do you mean? I asked, my heart beginning to race. She swallowed hard, her throat working as if she were forcing down something bitter. When she finally spoke, the words hit me like a punch to the gut. That's the man who kidnapped you when we were kids. Before I continue the conversation with my sister, I think it's important to tell you about the day I met the man from the tapes and how I remembered that day before all of this began. When I was a child, we moved around a lot because of my dad's job. I never really understood the details of what he did, just that he worked with the army. I know he served in the war because back then military service was mandatory. After that, he studied to become an engineer at the military university and stayed in that career path. But I couldn't tell you his rank or what exactly his role was. All I remember is the uniform hanging in his closet, crisp and immaculate, like a piece of another life. Because we moved so often, I didn't really get to know my grandparents on either side of the family. I knew they had both been in the army as well, but that was about it. Sometimes we talked to them on the phone, but I was too young to understand what those conversations were about. Their voices were just distant echoes in my childhood, blurred and incomplete. When I was about 6 years old, we moved to a small house near a base on the coast of Mar del Plata, just outside the city. I loved that place. If you stayed quiet enough, you could hear the faint sound of the sea in the distance, and nothing else. It was peaceful in a way that felt rare and precious, especially compared to the noise and chaos of living in the city, which is my life now. One afternoon, during my last class of the day at school, the teacher called me aside. She explained, with a patient smile, that my mom had run into some trouble with her car and would be late to pick me up. I nodded, more concerned with getting back to whatever I was doing, likely doodling on a scrap of paper, my mind already far from the conversation. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the day, I packed up my things and joined the stream of kids rushing out of the classroom. The usual chaos unfolded. Laughter, shouting, and the scramble of small feet on the tiled floor. As I stepped outside, scanning the familiar scene, something unusual caught my eye. Standing just beyond the school gates was Kimmy, our golden retriever. She was a beautiful dog, her golden fur almost glowing in the late afternoon light. She was everything you'd expect from a golden retriever, gentle, loving, and always eager to please. But beside her stood a man I didn't recognize. He was holding her leash casually, as if he had every right to be there. I froze for a moment, confused. It was definitely Kimmy. I'd recognize her anywhere. But this man, he was a stranger. My confusion quickly turned to curiosity, and without thinking too much about it, I walked toward them, my small hand tightening around the strap of my bag. "Excuse me," I said as I got closer, my voice tentative but steady. "Why do you have my dog?" He smiled, and I immediately noticed how old he looked. Deep wrinkles etched lines across his face, and his crooked nose bent downward in a way that struck me as funny. To my 6-year-old mind, he looked a bit like the cartoon vultures I had seen in movies. His eyes, soft, milky brown, didn't seem threatening, though. They reminded me of chocolate that had melted in the sun, warm and inviting. He crouched down to my level, moving slowly, like he didn't want to scare me. Then he just looked at me, his gaze full of something I couldn't quite name at the time. Admiration, maybe? Curiosity? Whatever it was, it made me feel important, like I was the center of his attention in a way that felt rare. "Your mom asked me to pick you up," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "She told me to bring Kimmy along so you wouldn't worry." He reached out a hand, carefully ruffling my hair like I was something delicate. "I'm your grandpa," he added with a small smile, as if that explained everything. My heart swelled with happiness. A grandpa, my grandpa. For as long as I could remember, I had listened to my friends talk about their grandparents. Their grandmas who baked cookies that smelled like magic. Their grandpas who taught them how to catch fireflies or bait a fishing hook. I didn't have stories like that. My world was just Mom, my sister, and Kimmy. I loved them, of course, but everything always felt the same with them. Routine. Predictable. But now, here was this man, my grandpa, promising me a piece of something I'd always envied. So I believed him. Without hesitation, I stepped forward and threw my arms around him, hugging him as tightly as my small frame could manage. He took my hand, his grip warm and steady, and led me toward his truck. It was an old thing, the kind of vehicle that rattled a little as it idled, with chipped paint and the faint smell of motor oil lingering in the air. He opened the back for Kimmy, giving her a firm but gentle pat on the head as he told her to hop in. Then he turned to me, gesturing toward the passenger seat with a smile. "Hop in, kiddo. You get the front seat," he said cheerfully, like it was some special privilege. As I climbed in, he slid into the driver's seat and turned to me with a question that caught me completely off guard. "So, where do you want to go first?" I blinked at him, unsure how to answer. "I thought we were going home," I admitted, my voice small and uncertain. "Well," he said, his smile widening, "what if we stop for ice cream first? Sound good?" Ice cream. My face lit up at the thought, and before I could even answer, we were already pulling out onto the road. The drive was easy, comfortable. He asked me all kinds of questions, ones that made me feel like the most fascinating person in the world. "What's your favorite game?" he asked, glancing at me with genuine interest. "Your favorite TV show? What about movies?" As I talked, he listened, really listened. His laugh was soft but warm, and he had this way of throwing in lighthearted jokes that made me feel clever and funny. "You're like a little expert," he said at one point, and I beamed, feeling proud of myself. When we arrived at the ice cream shop, he turned off the engine and looked at me with a twinkle in his eye. "Hey," he said, his tone playful, "check under your seat before we go in." I tilted my head, puzzled, but leaned down to look anyway. My fingers brushed against something smooth and crinkly, and my heart jumped. Wrapping paper. My hands worked quickly, pulling out the small, colorful package, and I tore through the paper like my life depended on it. Inside was a Care Bear. Care Bear. My gasp of delight must have been loud because he laughed. A deep, hearty laugh that seemed to fill the truck. "Knew you'd like that," he said, reaching into his pocket to hand me a sheet of Sailor Moon stickers. I stared at them in awe, clutching the Care Bear to my chest. He knew all the things I loved. And in that moment, sitting in the cab of his truck, I thought he must be the best grandpa in the entire world. After we got our ice creams, we wandered to the pier nearby, the kind that stretched out into the sea like a long wooden finger. The sun hung low in the sky, casting everything in a warm, golden light that danced across the waves. We sat on the edge, legs dangling over the side, eating our cones while the salty breeze played with my hair. It hit me then that I'd been doing all the talking. He'd asked me so much, made me feel so special, and yet I didn't know anything about him. So I turned to him, licking the last bit of ice cream from my cone, and asked, "Which one of my parents is your kid?" At the time, I didn't notice it, but his face shifted ever so slightly. The corners of his eyes pulled downward, and something heavy settled in his gaze. "Your mom," he said after a pause, his voice quiet, almost reluctant. He stared out at the horizon, as if the sea might give him the strength to say more. I tilted my head, curious. What was she like when she was my age? That made him smile, though it was a fragile kind of smile, one that seemed to teeter on the edge of something deeper. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out an old, worn wallet. From it, he extracted a photograph, black and white, creased at the edges. He handed it to me carefully, as if it were a relic. In the picture, a little girl with wavy hair tied into pigtails grinned at the camera. She couldn't have been older than 6. My breath caught as I recognized her immediately. She looked just like me. "That's your mom," he said, his voice softer now, as if the memory itself demanded reverence. She was always running around, full of questions, wanting to know everything about the world around her. Once, she scared the neighbors half to death because she climbed up to their window late at night to see what they were doing. He chuckled at the memory, though his voice cracked slightly, betraying a hint of sadness. "She was a handful," he added, his eyes glassy. After a moment, he reached over and placed the photo in my hand. "Here," he said, his tone serious now. "I want you to have this." I looked up at him, surprised. "Really?" He nodded, though his expression had grown somber. "Keep it safe," he said firmly. "Very safe, even from your parents. Your mom loved this picture. If she sees it, she'll take it from you, and you'll never see it again." He held my gaze for a long moment, his hand resting lightly over mine, as if sealing some kind of pact. "But now it's yours," he continued. "No one else has to know about it." I clutched the photo tightly, my fingers curling around its edges. His words felt like a secret, heavy and sacred, and I nodded solemnly, promising myself I'd guard it with all the care I could muster. I don't remember much after that, just fragments. How we talked as the sun dipped lower, the world painted in hues of gold and orange, and how, in that short time, I grew to love him. He treated me with such warmth and care, kind that felt like a soft blanket wrapping around you on a cold day. I remember feeling a pang of guilt, though. He'd given me so much. A gift, ice cream, his attention, and I had nothing for him in return. So, after a moment of hesitation, I tugged one of the hair ties from my ponytail and handed it to him. It wasn't much, but it was mine. He took it with a soft chuckle and a warm smile, treating it as though it were a treasure. Then the moment shifted. My sister appeared at the edge of the pier, her silhouette framed by the sinking sun. I lit up, waving her over eagerly, wanting to introduce her to the man I'd just met and already adored. "Come meet Grandpa," I called, my voice filled with excitement. But she didn't move. She just stood there, stiff and uncertain, her face pale. And then I saw him, my dad, emerging from behind her like a shadow. "Go on," my grandfather said gently, his voice low and calm. "Go with your sister. Your dad and we have some catching up to do." I hesitated, but he gave me an encouraging nod, his smile steady. Reluctantly, I obeyed, running down the pier toward my family. My dad crouched slightly to catch me in his arms as I threw myself at him, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "Dad," I began breathlessly, words spilling out as I tried to tell him about Grandpa, about the gifts and the stories and how wonderful he was. But my dad's face was different. His jaw was tight, and his eyes flicked past me toward the pier. "Later," he said curtly, his voice clipped. He set me down and straightened, his attention already elsewhere. I followed his gaze, looking back at the man I'd just met. Grandpa stood there, hands in his pockets, the same kind smile on his face, though now it seemed heavier, somehow. He gave me a small wave before turning his attention fully to my dad. I didn't understand then, but the air between them felt taut, like the string of a bow drawn too tight. And though I didn't know why, something inside me told me to hold on to that picture and the memory of this day as tightly as I could. I never saw my grandpa again. Every time I asked my dad about him, he'd just smile tightly and say he'd call him to see if he could visit. But even as a kid, I knew that call was never going to happen. When I asked my mom about her dad, she'd only say he was a good man and quickly change the subject. It was clear they didn't like him. Neither did my sister. That's why I never showed them the picture. I loved my grandpa. That day has always been special to me. So when my sister told me he was a kidnapper, it crushed me. Her version of the story was nothing like mine. She said Mom had asked her to pick me up from school that day since she was old enough to drive. But when she got there, I was nowhere to be found. They searched everywhere, and only after checking the surveillance footage did they figure out what had happened. The school called my parents right away. They looked for me everywhere. Eventually, a family friend spotted me with a stranger and called my dad, giving him the location. He rushed to find me, bringing my sister along so she could take me home once they got me back. She said it was like Dad already knew who the man was. He wasn't scared, just angry. When my sister saw me with that stranger, she felt a kind of fear she'd never known before. The thought of never seeing me again made her feel like the ground was giving way beneath her. But she promised Dad she wouldn't let me see how terrified she was. Months later, my dad sat me down and told me gently but firmly that my grandpa had died. I never knew how he died, but now I can't shake the feeling that my dad had something to do with it. A lot has happened since my last post, which is why I didn't update you all yesterday. I'll do my best to write everything down and catch you up. Some of you left really interesting comments under my last post. Comments about things I'd honestly rather not think about. But for now, I'll focus on what's been happening. After my sister and I finished talking about the man in the tapes, we just sat there in silence. I don't know where her thoughts were, but mine wandered back to his face. The way he looked that day on the pier. I couldn't shake the memory of his smile. The calm way he told me to go with my family. A kidnapper wouldn't act that way. At least, not the kind of kidnappers you hear about on the news. Maybe he was delusional. Maybe he truly believed I was his granddaughter. Or maybe he was a stalker. His appearance on those tapes would certainly suggest that. But at the time, I didn't know what to think. Part of me wanted to piece it all together, but another part of me didn't want to give those thoughts any weight. It was easier to let them sit in the shadows, unanswered. It struck me then. I'd never shown my sister the tapes of the woman in the forest. There was a chance, however small, that she might recognize something about them. She was older than me, after all. Maybe she'd remember if they were from an old movie or something like that. Felt like a long shot, but it was worth trying. I told her about the tapes, describing the strange, haunting scenes I'd watched. She frowned, her fingers drumming lightly against the table as she thought. "I don't know any movie like that," she said finally. "But maybe Camila would. She is attending to film school. Remember?" She was right, of course. If anyone would have an answer, it was Camila. Without wasting any more time, we called her, asking her to come back over so we could watch the tapes together. Maybe, just maybe, we'd find some answers. The three of us sat down and watched the tapes together. I kept my eyes fixed on them, but part of me was more interested in their reactions, especially to the second video. The sudden boom made my sister flinch in her seat, her hand darting to her chest as if to steady herself. Camila, on the other hand, barely moved. She watched with sharp, unwavering focus, her expression unreadable. When the screen finally went dark, Camila leaned back and thought for a moment before speaking. "It's not from any movie I know," she said finally. "If I had to guess, I'd say it's something that woman made herself. Maybe some kind of home video?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. The idea that the footage wasn't staged, that I might have just watched something real and possibly sinister, made my stomach churn. My sister shifted uncomfortably beside me, her unease plain on her face. "There are also some corrupted files," I said, breaking the suffocating silence. "I think there might be more videos on the pen drive, but they're damaged." "Clara," my sister started, her tone uneasy. She gave me that look, the one I knew so well, the one she wore every time she thought I was walking into something dangerous. "Maybe it's better to leave it alone. The man who took you, this woman on the tape, none of it feels right. And it's been, 30 years since any of this was recorded? What's the point of digging it all up now?" Her words hung heavy in the air. I wanted to argue, to say it did matter, but part of me couldn't help wondering if she was right. "I could ask someone at my school to try fixing those corrupted files," Camila said casually, brushing off everything my sister had just said. "Stuff like that happens all the time. Most of the time, there's no way to recover them, but it wouldn't hurt to try, right?" Her confidence was almost reassuring, but I still turned to my sister. "Is that okay with you?" She shrugged, her expression unreadable. "Mom found these tapes, didn't she? As weird as all of this is, I doubt anything on those files could be worse than what we've already seen." She sighed heavily, tension evident in her voice. Her words didn't ease the weight in my chest. Logically, she was probably right. What were the chances the corrupted files held anything worse than that haunting second video? The woman in the woods, her terror and sobs, the sudden boom. And yet, some instinct, deep and unshakable, whispered that we hadn't seen the worst of it. Something darker lay hidden, waiting. When I got home, the familiar scent of something cooking greeted me. Lucas was in the kitchen, humming to himself as he stirred a pot. Dinner was already in progress, and for a moment, everything felt perfectly normal. We slipped into our usual rhythm, talking about the same things we always did. His work, my work, the neighbors who still hadn't learned the concept of indoor voices, and the dream of a vacation we kept postponing. But my mind was elsewhere, tangled in the truth my sister had dropped on me earlier that day. The man who wasn't my grandfather. The story that unraveled everything I thought I knew. Part of me wanted to tell Lucas, to unload the weight pressing against my chest. But I hesitated. Acknowledging it felt like lighting a match near a pile of dry leaves. It would burn through our normal lives, leaving worry in its wake. His worry, and mine, the kind I'd rather keep buried. Before I could make up my mind, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was my dad. "Hi, kid." For the first time since the day he left, my dad's voice sounded clear over the phone. Not muffled or distant, but familiar, warm. I hadn't realized just how much I missed him until that moment. "Hey, Dad," I said, a little surprised. "Is something wrong?" It wasn't like him to call. He usually just texted. "Hey, Sergio." Lucas chimed in from the kitchen, flashing a big smile. My husband always got along well with my dad, a rare feat among the boyfriends I'd introduced to him over the years. Lucas had been the first and only one he genuinely liked. They kept in touch regularly, bonding over potential business ideas and shared hobbies. "Hey, Lucas," my dad replied, but his voice lacked its usual warmth. It wasn't outright cold, but something felt off. He sounded distracted, maybe even reluctant. "Clara," he said after a pause, "can we talk in private?" The shift in his tone made my stomach tighten. Sure, Dad. Give me a second." I glanced at Lucas, who raised an eyebrow in silent question. I forced a smile and excused myself, heading into the bedroom with the phone pressed tightly to my ear. After closing the door, I leaned against it and took a deep, deliberate breath, filling my lungs as much as I could. My dad had always been a man of few words. Not cold, exactly, but not one to linger on emotions or explanations. If there was a problem, he fixed it. No discussion of feelings, no analysis of the process, just action. He was a man of his time, pragmatic and straightforward. So for him to call, to actually want to talk about something, it unsettled me. "Okay, Dad," I said, my voice steadying itself as much for me as for him. "I'm alone. Is everything okay? Do you need something? Your mom told me she found some tapes," he began, diving straight in without preamble. "Said she took them to a store to virtualize them or something like that." His tone was matter-of-fact but carried a faint edge, like he wasn't quite sure how to frame what he was about to say. "She also mentioned you girls saw something strange. Something about a woman in the woods." I froze. My fingers tightened around the phone. For a second, all I could focus on was the faint hum of Lucas moving around in the kitchen, completely unaware of the tension knotting itself tighter in my chest. "Clara?" His voice cut through the silence, startling me. I hadn't realized how long I'd been quiet, lost in my thoughts. "Yes," I replied quickly, trying to steady myself. "We saw that, the woman in the woods, and some old family videos." I moved to the edge of the bed, sitting down as if grounding myself would keep my nerves in check. "Is something wrong with it?" "I see." His response was clipped, and then there was silence, save for the faint sound of him moving around on the other end of the line. His hesitation filled the air with a weight I couldn't shake. It was just the one video of the woman and the family tapes. He was fishing for something. That much was clear. The realization sent a sharp spike of anxiety through me. He knew more than he was letting on. "Yes," I answered cautiously. Then, after a moment of hesitation, I added, "But I found a second video later, at my house. It came with a couple of corrupted files." "You what?" His voice sharpened, and I heard the distinct sound of him freezing mid-movement. The air on the line seemed heavier, his breathing subtly deeper now. "And, did you watch that other video?" "Yes." That was all I could say. Even if I'd wanted to tell him more, the words wouldn't come. On the other end of the line, there was nothing but silence. I could picture him standing in the middle of his New York apartment, staring at the floor, stroking his beard the way he always did when he needed to think. "You and I need to talk about this," he said at last. His voice was steady, but there was a weight behind it that unsettled me. "I'll book a ticket and be there by the 3rd of December. Okay, honey?" I could hear the faint rustling of him moving around again, probably heading for his laptop. Thought of him coming back stirred something bittersweet in me. I felt a flicker of happiness, but it was tangled with nervousness. "Okay," I managed. "And Clara?" he added, his tone dropping an octave, becoming sharp and deliberate. "Yes. Don't try to look into those corrupted files before I get there." "Understood." There was no room for negotiation in his voice. It was an order, plain and simple. "Yes, Dad." "Good." He paused, lingering for a moment. I'll see you soon. We sat together in that silence, the space between us filled with things neither of us dared to say. Finally, he spoke again, softer this time. I love you. The words hit me harder than I expected. My dad wasn't the kind of man to say those things lightly. A tear slipped down my cheek before I could stop it. I love you too, Dad. I was ready to end the call, my thumb hovering over the button, when a thought crossed my mind. It was intrusive, sharp, and impossible to ignore. By the way, Dad. My voice was hesitant, but I pressed on. How did Grandpa die? Silence. The kind that chills you, that stretches longer than it should. We'll talk when I get there, he said at last, his voice flat, almost distant, and then the line went dead. After the conversation with my father, I returned to the kitchen. Lucas must have seen something on my face because he immediately rushed to my side. Concern etched into his features. Is everything okay? Did something happen to your dad? He asked, his voice tinged with worry. I shook my head, though the weight of the conversation still clung to me. No, nothing happened to him. He's fine. He's just coming back sooner than I thought. His brows furrowed in confusion. Why? I realized then that I couldn't keep it from him any longer. I needed to tell him everything. Taking a deep breath, I began. I told him about the man on the tapes, how my sister recognized him as the man who had kidnapped me when I was a child, how my parents had kept that secret from me for all these years. Lucas didn't interrupt, didn't offer his thoughts right away. He just listened, his hand resting gently on my back, rubbing slow, comforting circles as I spoke. Encouraged by his quiet support, I continued, telling him about the videos of the woman in the forest, how my sister and Camila didn't recognize them as part of any movie, how we all feared the same thing, that they might be real. Finally, I told him about my father, about the way he seemed to already know about the tapes, how he had insisted I not touch the corrupted files until he arrived. As I spoke, the weight of everything began to feel a little lighter, though the questions swirling in my mind remained unanswered. When I finished, I glanced at Lucas, expecting a barrage of questions or perhaps a look of disbelief. Instead, his hand paused on my back, and he pulled me closer, wrapping me in his arms. We'll figure this out, he murmured. You're not alone in this, Clara. I wanted to believe him. More than anything, I wanted to believe we could find the truth and still keep our lives intact. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. 3 days later, I received an email from an unfamiliar sender. The subject line read, "Regarding the corrupted files." My stomach tightened as I clicked on it, an inexplicable dread pooling in my chest. The message read, "Dear Miss Franco, your niece gave me a couple of corrupted video files and asked if I could recover them. I did as she requested, but when she came to pick them up, I asked her about their origin. She told me you had given them to her. The content of these videos is something I wouldn't recommend anyone watch. The image quality isn't perfect, but it's clear enough to understand what is happening. That is why I insisted on getting your contact information instead of giving them back to your niece." She agreed. Camila mentioned your family history and that her grandmother had found these old tapes in her house. After reviewing the files, I can tell you this. Their content is deeply disturbing and tied to the darkest chapters of our country's history. The videos depict military officers torturing civilians. Based on the context and footage, I believe they document acts committed during the dictatorship, evidence of the desaparecidos, the people who were made to vanish under the military juntas. I strongly urge you not to view the content of these files. Instead, I recommend reaching out to the Madres de Plaza de Mayo or a related organization that can help navigate this sensitive matter. For legal purposes, I have attached the restored files to this email, though I sincerely hope you never need to open them. I am deeply sorry. Sincerely, Professor Garcia. I sat there staring at the screen, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts. My hand hovered over the attachments, but I couldn't bring myself to click on them. The weight of what they might contain pressed down on me, crushing, suffocating. That night, sleep evaded me entirely. My mind was a storm, thoughts swirling too fast to grasp. Yet one rose above the chaos, clear and unrelenting. My dad was arriving in the country that morning. Couldn't move, couldn't bring myself to close my eyes. The weight of the email, the restored files, and the implications of it all pressed down on me like a suffocating blanket. The hours crawled by, and with each passing minute, the anticipation of his arrival grew heavier. I didn't know if I wanted answers or if I wanted to run from them, but one thing was certain. The morning would come, and with it, my father. It's been a few days since I saw my dad, and only now have I managed to summon the strength to share what happened. I don't have much to say yet. My thoughts are still a tangled mess, but I'll start with that day. Some of you were right in ways I wish you hadn't been. As I drove to my parents' house, a memory from my teenage years surfaced, unbidden and vivid. I was 15 then, coming home from what had been, up until that point, the worst day of my life. I had a boyfriend, my first, named Carlos. For as long as I could remember, I'd had the biggest crush on him. When he finally asked me out, I was over the moon. In my head, I'd already written a whole future for us. Wedding bells, a little house, children running in the yard. I was hopelessly naive. Carlos knew I adored him, and he used that knowledge to his advantage. At first, he was sweet and charming, the perfect boyfriend. But as the months went by, he started testing my boundaries. He was patient, persistent. Bit by bit, I gave in. By the time he got what he wanted, I was too blind in my devotion to see the truth about him. The very next day, he broke up with me. Worse, he told all his friends what had happened. I could feel their judgment in their stares, the way they whispered when I walked by. In a single day, I went from being just another girl to being that girl. When I got home, I went straight to my room and shut the door, locking it tight behind me. My parents must have sensed something was wrong. They knocked and called out to me, but I ignored them, turning my music up as loud as it would go. I knew I'd catch hell for that later, but I didn't care. I just wanted to cry in peace, to bury myself in my bed and never come out. When the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the house in a soft, dusky light, I finally emerged from my room to head to the bathroom. My dad was standing right there, just outside my door, waiting silently. His arms were crossed, but his expression betrayed him. His eyes were filled with quiet worry. "I made you something to eat," he said gently. "Do you want to have it in the dining room or your room?" I didn't trust myself to face him at the table, so I chose my room. By the time I returned, the food was already on my desk. A simple sandwich, neatly placed on a plate. Beside it was a small note, written in his unmistakable handwriting. 3 words stared back at me. "I love you." I cried when I read it. The guilt of making him worry hit me like a wave, overwhelming and relentless. He didn't yell. He didn't demand answers. He just stood there, offering quiet support in the only way he knew how. After eating the sandwich, I sat on my bed and tried to collect myself. My tears dried, though the ache in my chest remained. I knew I couldn't avoid the truth any longer. Whatever happened next, his anger, his disappointment, I would face it. He deserved honesty no matter the cost. I called him into my room, my voice barely louder than a whisper. He appeared almost immediately, his footsteps soft, as if he didn't want to startle me. Sitting down beside me, he asked, "What's wrong?" I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I clutched them together. My throat felt tight, my voice unsteady, but I forced the words out. My eyes burned from all the crying I'd already done. But I looked at him and told him everything, every last detail. When I finished, he looked at me, his silence heavier than any words could have been. I braced myself for the anger, for the disappointment I was so sure would follow. But instead, what I saw in his eyes was something far more complicated. Anger, yes, but not at me. It was a molten, searing fury that could have melted steel, directed at someone who wasn't in the room. Beneath that, there was sadness, deep and endless, like an ocean you could drown in. And then there was something else, something I couldn't quite name. But it wasn't disappointment. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, and before I could say anything, he wrapped his arms around me. The hug was silent but full of infinite love, so steady and strong that I couldn't hold back my tears. I cried into his chest, and he held me tighter, as if to shield me from every hurt in the world. "Everything's going to be okay," he murmured softly, his voice steady and warm. "You'll always be my special girl, Clara. Nothing will ever change that. Nothing." That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt safe. As the weight of everything began to settle, I asked him, in a voice barely above a whisper, if he could stay with me until I fell asleep. I didn't want to be alone, not yet. He didn't hesitate. "Of course," he said, pulling the chair from my desk closer to my bed. I remember waking up the next morning to find him still there, sitting slumped in the chair, fast asleep. His hand was resting on the edge of my bed, as if even in sleep, he refused to let me go. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, the memory of my father asleep beside my bed replaying in my head like an old, comforting film. It felt ironic, bitterly so, that now, after everything, I didn't want to get out and walk into my parents' house to see him. Before the tapes, I would have been ecstatic. I used to miss him so much whenever he went on his trips. But now, the thought of seeing him filled me with a dread so heavy it almost made me turn the key and drive away. But that wasn't an option. With a deep breath, I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin, and used my key to open the front door. As it clicked open, I called out, "Hello!" loud enough to be heard from wherever they might be. My dad appeared almost instantly, emerging from the kitchen with his familiar gait. His face lit up when he saw me, and he closed the distance quickly, pulling me into a tight hug. His arms wrapped around me with all the affection I remembered, but I couldn't bring myself to hug him back. "3 months is too long," he said, kissing my cheek like he always did. I forced a smile, though it felt wrong, lopsided. "Yeah, especially at your age, Dad. You should just retire and stay with Mom. She gets really lonely." My eyes flicked over his shoulder, searching for her, but the house was still. She didn't come out to greet me. Speaking of which, where is Mom? The lightness in his face dimmed as though a switch had been flipped. It was subtle but unmistakable. The joy drained away, replaced by something heavier, something that made my stomach twist. "I told her to keep herself busy today," he said, his voice quieter now. "You and I need to talk. Alone." My heart sank. The weight of his words pressed on me, and I suddenly felt cold, even in the warmth of the house. "Okay," I said hesitantly, trying to keep my voice steady. "How should we do this?" He led me to the living room, the same living room where I had first watched the video of the woman in the woods. Sitting there now, the air felt heavier, suffocating. We didn't speak for a few seconds, but those seconds stretched out endlessly. I could feel the tension building, sharp and unbearable, like the static charge before a storm. I watched his face shift, slowly, imperceptibly at first. The warm familiarity of my father's expression faded, replaced by something colder, sterner, a figure of authority rather than a parent. He was trying, I could tell, to find the right way to begin, to pick the right words. But the weight of whatever he wanted to say hung in the air, suffocating both of us. Finally, he spoke. His voice was cold, distant, stripped of any warmth. "Did you do as I told you?" The tone hit me like a slap. It sent me back to my childhood, to moments when his words were enough to make me shrink into myself, to feel like a little girl again. My nerves fluttered, but I steadied myself. "No," I replied, my voice calm despite the tightness in my chest. "I didn't watch the rest of the videos, but I know what's on them. Military men torturing people." His face didn't betray a single emotion, but I felt the weight of my words in the way his shoulders stiffened ever so slightly. The silence that followed was thick, heavier than before, filled with things neither of us dared to say. "I see." That was all he said. The words hung in the air, thin and fragile, as if they could break under the weight of what wasn't being said. I waited a couple of seconds, my heart pounding against my ribs, before speaking again. "Why did you guys have this?" My voice wavered, anger and confusion tangled in every syllable. "It's horrific. What are tapes of torture and a—" I paused, swallowing hard. The next word felt too heavy, too sharp to let out. "Murder. Doing alongside videos of my childhood and family trips." He sighed deeply, the kind of sigh that seemed to pull years from his body. For a moment, I saw him differently, not as my father, but as a man carrying the weight of something too dark, too large for one person to bear. He looked older than I'd ever seen him. "I thought I got rid of those tapes," he admitted, his voice low, almost resigned. "I'd never imagined your mother made copies of them. I thought I was ready for anything he might say, for any dark truth he could reveal." But hearing him admit it outright, that he knew what the tapes contained, that he'd tried to erase them, shattered me. My world splintered in that moment, the pieces too jagged and sharp to ever fit back together. He knew, and he'd tried to bury the truth. Whatever came next would only drive the knife deeper into my chest, and I wasn't sure I could survive it. The silence between us felt alive, heavy and breathing, pressing down on my chest like an iron weight. My father, no, the man I had called my father, sat across from me, his hands resting on his knees. His posture was rigid, his jaw clenched tightly as if he could will himself into stone. But his eyes betrayed him. They were fixed on the floor, darting occasionally as though searching for some invisible escape. I broke the silence first. My voice, thin and sharp, wavered under the weight of the question I was terrified to ask. "What did you do?" He sighed, the sound long and heavy, as though he'd been holding it in for decades. Slowly, he ran a hand over his face, and when he finally looked up, his eyes held something I hadn't expected. Not guilt, not shame, defiance. "I followed orders," he said, his tone cold and measured, like a soldier reciting a report. "Orders." The word twisted in my throat. "Orders to kidnap my parents? To erase them from existence?" My voice cracked, trembling with anger I could barely contain. He flinched, but his expression hardened quickly, as though the weakness embarrassed him. "Your father," he began, his voice clipped, "was a university professor. He taught literature, but he wasn't innocent. He hid 3 students who were wanted by the state. That made him a threat." I froze, his words striking me like a slap. "He taught literature," I said, incredulous. "That's what made him dangerous? Reading books." His lips pressed into a thin line. "He harbored fugitives, Clara. They were guerrillas planning attacks. He knew exactly what he was doing. And you, I demanded, leaning forward, my voice rising. Did you know what you were doing? When you dragged them out of their home, when you watched them disappear, did you know what you were doing? His silence stretched, damning in its refusal to break. They were enemies of the state, he said finally, his voice brittle. It wasn't my decision. I was just following protocol. Protocol? I spat, the word bitter on my tongue. You're hiding behind that like it absolves you. You had a choice, and you chose this. What was I supposed to do? His voice cracked, but not from regret. It was defensive, angry. Refuse orders? End up like them? Do you think I had the luxury of moral outrage? Yes, I shouted, the force of it surprising even me. Yes, you were supposed to refuse. You were supposed to be human. For a moment his mask slipped. His shoulders sagged, his eyes darting away from mine. But then he straightened again, his composure snapping back into place. I did what I could, he said quietly, the words almost lost in the oppressive silence. I made sure you were safe. Safe. The word burned like acid in my throat. You knew, I said, my voice trembling. You knew who I was. From the beginning, didn't you? His gaze faltered, but he didn't deny it. Yes, he admitted, the word landing like a death knell. How? I asked, though every part of me screamed not to. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. He hesitated, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. Your mother, he said finally, his voice low and detached, was pregnant when we arrested her. The world seemed to tilt. My breath caught, my vision swimming. Pregnant. My mother. The woman who existed only as shadow in old tapes. A sob in the dark. The woman I had never known but who had been everything to me without my even realizing it. That's how I knew who you were, he continued, his tone clinical. When they gave you to us, I recognized you immediately. You looked like her. A cold, hollow pit opened in my chest. And what happened to her? The words felt foreign, like they were being spoken by someone else. She didn't make it, he said, his voice flat. Neither of them did. They were classified as subversives. It wasn't. Don't. I cut him off, my voice sharp and cracking. Don't you dare tell me it wasn't your decision. You were there. You watched them die. And then you brought me into this house and pretended you were some kind of savior. I gave you a life, he said, his voice rising with an edge of desperation. A chance. Do you think they could have given you that? They were criminals, Clara. They would have. Stop, I screamed, the word reverberating off the walls. Just stop. You don't get to rewrite history. You don't get to steal me and call it salvation. He recoiled as though I had struck him, his face pale and hollow. For a moment I thought he might cry, but I didn't care. Couldn't care. You raised me, I said, my voice trembling with anger and something else I couldn't name. You fed me, clothed me, tucked me into bed at night, all while knowing you had taken everything from me. How do you live with yourself? I thought I was doing the right thing, he whispered, his voice barely audible. The right thing, I repeated, laughing bitterly. For who? For me? For you? You think this is what they would have wanted for me? To be raised by the man who destroyed them. I wanted to protect you, he said, but his voice lacked conviction now. He looked smaller, the weight of his sins finally crushing him. I wanted to give you the life they never could. I pushed back my chair abruptly, the screech of wood against tile cutting through the air like a knife. You didn't give me a life, I said, my voice low and trembling with fury. You took it. You stole me, and you stole them from me. He didn't stop me as I walked away. I didn't look back. Outside, the cold air hit my face like a slap, sharp and biting. Felt real, more real than the man inside that house. More real than the lies he had woven around me for years. I leaned against the car, my body shaking, tears streaming down my face. The truth was an unbearable weight, pressing down on my chest until I couldn't breathe. I stared up at the sky, letting the cold numb me. I thought of my mother, pregnant and terrified, her life taken before she ever got the chance to hold me. I thought of my father, a man who had risked everything to protect his students, only to lose it all. And then I thought of him, my so-called father, sitting in that room, his hands clean in his own mind, even as the blood dripped from them. I didn't just lose my parents. He erased them. That night, I didn't go home. Instead, I drove aimlessly through the city for hours, letting the hum of the radio and the glow of passing streetlights distract me from the chaos in my mind. The streets were my refuge, the motion keeping the thoughts at bay. But every time a red light forced me to stop, reality would creep back in, sharp and relentless. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel until my nails dug into the leather, the pain grounding me just enough to hold back the tears threatening to spill over. Eventually, hunger caught up with me, and I pulled into a gas station. I sat under the harsh fluorescent lights, eating a burger that tasted like cardboard, more out of necessity than desire. My thoughts churned in the background, a relentless storm. But then one idea surfaced, a dark, terrifying thought. It made my stomach twist, but the more I stared at it, the more it solidified. I told myself it was the only thing left to do, the last piece of this unbearable puzzle. With trembling fingers, I sent a text to Lucas, telling him I'd be staying with my sister. The lie felt hollow even as I typed it, but it was easier than explaining. Then, without hesitation, I turned off my phone and let the screen go dark, as if that could silence the world for a little while. The first hotel I saw became my sanctuary. I walked into the lobby and forced a smile at the receptionist, every muscle in my face straining against the weight of my emotions. Checking in felt like a surreal performance, a play I had no interest in acting out. But somehow, I made it through. The fake smile still plastered on my face as I took the key and climbed the stairs to a room that promised no comfort, but at least some solitude. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the laptop. I sat on the edge of the bed, the cheap polyester blanket tangled around my legs. The key to the pen drive felt heavier than it should in my hand, as though it carried all the weight of the truth I was about to uncover. I stared at the laptop screen, my thumb hesitating over the touchpad. A part of me wanted to leave it closed, to walk away and let this nightmare end. But the curiosity, the need, was too strong. If I didn't watch, I would never move on. And I needed to know. The first video loaded slowly, the spinning icon on the screen matching the pounding rhythm of my heart. When it began, the image was shaky, the camera focusing on nothing but the dirt floor of a dimly lit room. Then the voices started. At first, they were muffled, low, and unintelligible. Then the camera shifted, and I saw them. Two men, their heads hooded, their hands bound behind their backs, kneeling on the ground. A third man paced in front of them, his boots crunching against the dirt. His voice was calm, methodical, but the words he spoke were laced with venom. "Names," he said. "Give me the names." The camera moved again, making the face of the interrogator barely recognizable. My stomach dropped. It was him, my so-called father, younger but unmistakable. His expression was cold, detached, the face of someone who had done this 100 times and would do it 100 more. My hands clenched the edges of the laptop as the scene unfolded. One of the hooded men groaned, his voice hoarse. "I don't know anything," he said, barely audible. The sound that followed made my blood run cold. A sharp, wet crack as the interrogator's fist connected with the man's jaw. The groan turned into a muffled cry, the man doubling over as blood dripped onto the ground beneath him. "Stop lying," he said, his voice sharp and cutting. "You're only making this harder on yourself." The camera panned to the second figure, who trembled but said nothing. Something about his posture, the way his shoulders were hunched, the protective angle of his body, made my breath catch. It was him, my father, my real father. A wave of nausea washed over me, my vision swimming. I wanted to close the laptop, to turn away, but I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped by the image on the screen. My fake father stepped toward him, his shadow falling over the man. "And you," he said, "you're the one who hid them, aren't you? You thought you could outsmart us." The man lifted his head slightly, and though the hood obscured his face, I could feel his defiance. He didn't speak, but his silence was answer enough. "Fine," said his tormentor, the tone of his voice chillingly calm. "If you won't talk, we'll try another method." The camera shifted again, and suddenly my mother was there. She was seated in a chair, her hands tied behind her back, her face pale but resolute. Her stomach, rounded and unmistakable, told me everything I needed to know. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. She was pregnant. She was pregnant with me. The man who raised me crouched in front of her, his expression softening in a way that made me sick. "We don't have to do this," he said, his voice almost gentle. "Just tell us what we need to know, and you can go home. You and your child." She stared at him, her face a mixture of terror and fury. "You'll kill us anyway," she said, her voice trembling but steady. He didn't respond, just straightened and nodded to someone off-screen. The screen blurred as the camera moved again, and the next sound was one I would never forget. A scream, my mother's scream. I slammed the laptop shut, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. My hands shook violently, my vision blurred by tears. The room felt too small, the walls closing in around me. I stumbled to the bathroom, barely making it to the sink before the bile rose in my throat. I retched until there was nothing left, my body trembling with the force of it. When I finally straightened, gripping the edges of the sink for support, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes wide and bloodshot. I didn't recognize the person staring back at me. I sank to the floor, my knees pressed against the cold tile. The truth was too much, too overwhelming. He knew. He had known all along. And he had done this. The screams from the video echoed in my mind, a haunting refrain that would never leave me. They weren't just my parents. They were his victims. Several days have passed since I began writing this, but the memory of that video still haunts me. I'm not sure I'll ever be able to forget it. My mother's scream, raw and piercing, echoes in my mind. The only fragment of her voice I will ever hear. It lingers, filling the silence, a reminder of everything I've lost without ever truly knowing. I don't know what to do. When I first watched those old tapes, it was supposed to be a moment of nostalgia, a peek into the past. I never imagined it would tear my world apart. In hindsight, my life had been blissfully normal, perfect, even, but in just a few days that illusion shattered. I uncovered the truth about my parents, and in the process, lost what I thought was my family. But was it ever truly a family, if it was built on lies? The most heartbreaking part is that I have no idea how to honor my real parents. They are little more than ghosts to me, shadows in the dark. All I have is a single photograph of my mother and those terrible, grainy videos. I don't know their names. I don't know anything about them. And the people who might have known, the ones who could help me piece together their story, are all gone. I've spent hours scouring the internet, poring over lists and archives of the desaparecidos. There are so many names, so many faces, but none I can pin to the memories I wish I had. It's overwhelming, like trying to find a single star in a galaxy. Professor Garcia suggested reaching out to organizations that specialize in these cases, people who could help me trace my parents' identities. But the thought terrifies me. What if I learn more than I can handle? What if the truth is worse than what I already know? This all happened so long ago, yet its shadow stretches into my life, into the present. Most of those responsible have served their sentences or are already dead, their crimes buried with them. But not that man. He still walks free. He lived his life to the fullest, built a family, raised me, and somehow he used me, my very existence, as a shield against the atrocities he committed. That thought makes my stomach turn, fills me with a cold, paralyzing dread. There are nights when I wonder if I'll ever feel whole again, if I'll ever know who I truly am. My real parents are strangers to me, yet they're the foundation of everything I've been searching for. How do I mourn people I never knew? How do I carry the weight of their legacy, their suffering, when all I have are fragments, just questions and echoes? I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry, Dad. I hope one day I'll be brave enough to find you. I hope I'll learn your names, your faces, your stories. And I hope that wherever you are, you'll know that I am trying to remember you, trying to honor you, trying to be the person you might have wanted me to be.